The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport's Terminal B when James Wilson adjusted his navy blue service medal pinned carefully to his jacket. His faithful companion, a gentle German shepherd named Scout, sat quietly by his side, wearing his official service dog vest. At 45, James carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from years of military service, though the slight tremor in his hands told a different story, one of sacrifices made in the skies over Afghanistan. "Gate B-23, right, buddy?" he whispered to Scout, who responded with an alert but calm gaze. The pair made their way through the bustling terminal, where morning travelers rushed past with their rolling suitcases and coffee cups. James couldn't help but notice how some people's eyes lingered a bit too long on him and Scout, something he'd grown accustomed to over the years. As they approached the Delta Airlines counter, James pulled out a carefully organized folder containing Scout's service animal documentation. He'd learned to be prepared, always carrying multiple copies after previous encounters with skeptical airline staff. The gate agent, a friendly older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, barely glanced at the papers before warmly welcoming them aboard. "Thank you for your service, sir," the agent said with genuine respect in his voice. "You and Scout are all set for Flight 2387 to Los Angeles." James nodded gratefully, appreciating the simple human kindness. As they waited in the pre-boarding area, he watched families saying goodbye, business people tapping away on their laptops, and a young mother trying to console her crying baby. These ordinary moments helped ground him, reminding him of why he'd served in the first place. But the calm morning took an unexpected turn as they boarded the aircraft. A flight attendant with perfectly pressed uniform and tightly pulled back hair watched them enter with an expression that made James's stomach tighten. He recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen countless times before, a mix of suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Scout sensed his anxiety, pressing closer to James's leg as they made their way down the aisle to seat 14C. Other passengers smiled or nodded as they passed, some even reaching out to pet Scout before catching themselves and politely asking permission first. James always appreciated when people understood service dog etiquette. They settled into their seats, Scout tucking himself perfectly under the row in front, just as he'd been trained. James took slow, measured breaths, using the techniques his therapist had taught him. The familiar weight of his service medal against his chest reminded him of who he was, 20 years in the Air Force, decorated combat veteran, someone who'd earned his place here like anyone else. He was just beginning to relax when he saw the same flight attendant marching purposefully toward him, a face set in what could only be described as determined disapproval. Her heels clicked sharply against the airplane's floor, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made several heads turn. "I need to see your dog's paperwork." James reached for his folder, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Scout remained perfectly still, demonstrating the impeccable training that had taken months to perfect. As James handed over the documentation, he couldn't help but notice how the flight attendant held the papers at arm's length, as if they might bite. The murmur of boarding passengers continued around them, but James could feel the shift in the atmosphere. A young woman across the aisle had stopped scrolling through her phone, her attention now fixed on the unfolding scene. An elderly couple a few rows ahead turned in their seats, their expressions concerned. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that nobody on Flight 2387 could have predicted, least of all the flight attendant who was about to discover just how wrong first impressions could be. But for now, James simply sat there, his hand resting on Scout's head, waiting for what he knew was coming. 20 years of service had taught him many things, and patience in the face of prejudice was one of them. The air felt heavy with tension as other passengers continued to board, creating a backdrop of rolling suitcases and shuffling feet to what was quickly becoming much more than a routine document check. James could feel his pulse quickening, but years of combat experience had taught him to keep his exterior calm. Scout, sensing his internal struggle, pressed his nose gently against James's hand. A silent reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Little did anyone know that high above the airport, a pilot was preparing for his approach to Atlanta, completely unaware that his next flight would involve much more than just flying a plane from one city to another. The morning sun continued to rise over the airport, its golden light streaming through the small airplane windows, illuminating what was about to become a story that would touch hearts across the nation. The first officer began walking down the aisle, his movements purposeful but unhurried. Passengers watched his approach with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. The flight attendant straightened her posture even more, clearly preparing to defend her position to a superior officer. But there was something in the first officer's expression, a look of recognition, of personal investment, that suggested this situation was about to take a turn that nobody aboard Flight 2387 could have predicted. The early morning sun streaming through the airplane windows cast long shadows down the aisle as he approached, highlighting the tension on every face turned to watch his advance. Scout's ears perked up slightly, sensing a shift in the energy around them. James kept his hand on his service dog's head, drawing strength from the animal's unwavering presence. 20 years of military service had taught him to read situations, to anticipate outcomes, but even he couldn't have guessed what was about to happen next. The first officer was now just a few rows away, and in the pregnant silence that had fallen over the cabin, the soft click of his shoes against the airplane floor seemed to echo with each step. The next few moments would not only change the course of this flight, but would also spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the confines of this aircraft, touching hearts and minds across the country. Last edited 13 hours ago, the first officer stood at the end of James's row, his presence commanding immediate attention throughout the cabin. A subtle change crossed the flight attendant's face as she noticed his shoulder bars, the kind of change that suggested she was recalculating her position. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the gold threading on his uniform, creating an almost ethereal effect. "Is there a problem here?" the first officer asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes not from volume, but from confidence. His eyes moved between James, Scout, and the flight attendant, taking in the scene with professional assessment. The flight attendant straightened her posture even more, if that was possible. "Sir, I was just explaining to this passenger that we need to verify his service animal documentation." She held up the papers like evidence in a trial. "They seem irregular to me." A young mother in the window seat nearby was trying to calm her frustrated toddler, who had picked up on the tension in the air. The child's whimpers provided an uncomfortable soundtrack to the confrontation. Scout, demonstrating his extensive training, remained perfectly still despite the noise. "Ma'am," the first officer began, "I couldn't help but overhear from the cockpit." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Those documents appear to be perfectly standard VA-issued service animal papers. I should know, I've seen quite a few in my time." The flight attendant's grip on the papers tightened slightly. "But sir, we have protocols." "Yes, we do," the first officer interrupted smoothly. "And one of those protocols is respecting valid service animal documentation when it's presented." He turned to James, his expression softening. "Vietnam or Gulf?" "Afghanistan," James replied quietly. 20 years Air Force. Scout helps with the PTSD. A murmur of understanding rippled through the nearby passengers. The teenager who had been recording everything slowly lowered her phone, her expression shifting from entertainment to something more somber, more respectful. The first officer nodded, a look of understanding crossing his face. "I flew C-130s there myself. Different kind of pressure up there, isn't it?" The shared experience hung between them like an invisible bond. The flight attendant's face had begun to pale, the realization dawning that she might have seriously misread the situation. I was just trying to ensure." "I understand being thorough," the first officer cut in, his tone professional but firm. "But there's a difference between following protocols and creating unnecessary confrontation." He gestured to Scout, who remained a picture of calm discipline. "This is clearly a well-trained service animal supporting a veteran who served our country. The documentation is valid. The situation is clear." An older gentleman across the aisle, who had been watching silently until now, cleared his throat. "My son came back from Iraq," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "These service dogs, they're lifesavers, literally." Several heads nodded in agreement. The flight attendant's hands had begun to tremble slightly, but she made one last attempt to maintain her position. "But sir, the airline's policy." "I'm very familiar with our airline's policy," the first officer stated, his voice carrying a note of finality. "And our policy explicitly supports service animals accompanying veterans with proper documentation." He paused, then added more quietly, "which you have in your hands." The cabin had grown so quiet you could hear the distant sound of ground crews outside the plane. The young mother's toddler had finally settled, perhaps sensing the shift in atmosphere. Scout remained at James's feet, a steady presence in the storm of human emotion swirling around them. But what happened next would transform this confrontation into something none of them expected. The first officer reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out his wallet. What he was about to reveal would change not just the course of this flight, but potentially airline policy across the country. The tension in the cabin was palpable as he opened his wallet, every eye fixed on his movements. Even the flight attendant seemed to be holding her breath. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays creating long shadows down the aircraft's aisle, adding an almost theatrical quality to the moment. James watched the first officer's face, noting a subtle change in his expression, something personal, something beyond professional duty. Scout's ears twitched forward, sensing the shift in energy around them. The next few moments would reveal a connection that would leave everyone on board Flight 2387 speechless. The first officer held his wallet open, angling it so the flight attendant could see its contents clearly. His next words would send ripples through not just the cabin, but eventually through social media, news outlets, and airline boardrooms across America. The story of what happened on this Atlanta to Los Angeles flight was about to become much more than a simple dispute over service animal documentation. The early morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the scene as if nature itself was providing a spotlight for what was about to unfold. Nobody in the cabin could have predicted the twist that was coming, a revelation that would transform this moment of confrontation into a powerful lesson about assumptions, respect, and the unexpected connections that bind us all together. Inside the wallet, protected by a clear plastic sleeve, was a photograph. The first officer held it up, letting the morning sunlight illuminate the image. A younger version of James in his Air Force uniform, standing proudly next to a small boy wearing an oversized pilot's cap. The boy's smile was unmistakable, a perfect match to the one now worn by the first officer standing in the aisle. "This man," the first officer said, his voice carrying a gentle strength that commanded attention, "is my father." The revelation hit the cabin like a wave. Several passengers gasped. The flight attendant's face drained of color as the full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. The teenager who had been recording everything dropped her phone into her lap, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. 20 years ago, the first officer continued, turning to address not just the flight attendant but the entire cabin, "My father flew combat missions over Afghanistan while I stayed home, counting days until he returned. When he came back, he wasn't the same. The war had left scars that weren't visible to the eye." He paused, letting his words sink in. Scout, as if sensing the importance of the moment, sat up straighter at James's feet. The older gentleman who had spoken about his son in Eric wiped his eyes discreetly with his handkerchief. "That's when Scout came into our lives," the first officer explained, his professional demeanor softening as he looked at the service dog. "I watched this amazing animal help my father find his way back to us, one day at a time. Scout didn't just give me back my father, he inspired my career choice." The flight attendant clutched the service dog papers to her chest, her earlier hostility replaced by visible shame. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly the point," the first officer replied, not unkindly. "We never know someone's full story just by looking at them. Every passenger who boards this plane carries their own history, their own struggles, their own triumphs." A baby's gentle coo from a few rows back broke the tension, drawing a few nervous laughs from the passengers. The sound seemed to remind everyone that life's simple, sweet moments continue even during difficult times. "When I was 12, the first officer continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, "I decided I wanted to follow in my father's footsteps. Not into combat, but into the skies. Every time I saw him with Scout, watching how this trained service animal could bring peace to a warrior's heart, I knew I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself." James looked up at his son, pride evident in his eyes despite the lingering tension of the situation. Scout's tail thumped softly against the floor, perhaps the only one in the cabin completely at ease with the unfolding drama. The senior flight attendant, who had been watching from the galley, stepped forward. "I think we need to apologize," she said, directing her words primarily at her younger colleague. "This is not how we treat any of our passengers, especially not our veterans." The cabin erupted in supportive murmurs and nods of agreement. A businessman in first class had stood up to get a better view of what was happening, his morning newspaper forgotten in his lap. Two flight attendants from the back of the plane had made their way forward, drawn by the powerful scene unfolding. The first officer reached down and gave Scout a gentle pat, a gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between his current role as airline pilot and his childhood memories of finding comfort in the dog's presence during his father's difficult days. "You know," he said, addressing the entire cabin now, "every time I step into that cockpit, I carry two things with me: the lessons my father taught me about service and sacrifice, and the understanding that every person on this aircraft deserves respect, dignity, and the benefit of the doubt." The morning sun had risen higher now, its warm light filling the cabin with a golden glow that seemed to soften the harsh edges of the confrontation. Outside the windows, ground crews continued their work, unaware of the powerful moment of human connection taking place inside the aircraft. The flight attendant who had caused the initial confrontation took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as if preparing herself for what she needed to do next. Her next words would demonstrate whether this moment would become a true turning point or remain just another uncomfortable incident in the long history of air travel. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how this story would continue to unfold. But one thing was already clear: Flight 2387 would be remembered not just for this dramatic revelation, but for what it taught everyone on board about judgment, compassion, and the unexpected ways our lives intersect with others. The flight attendant slowly lowered the service dog papers, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed out the creases she had made. The morning light caught the tears welling in her eyes as she looked between father and son, the reality of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. She began, her voice catching. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I am so deeply sorry. My behavior was inexcusable." The words came out raw and honest, stripped of the defensive pride that had fueled her early actions. The first officer nodded encouragingly, while James reached down to scratch behind Scout's ears, a gesture that seemed to ground him in the moment. The service dog remained a picture of calm dignity, his presence a silent reminder of why this conversation mattered so much. "You know," the first officer said, his voice gentle but carrying throughout the now silent cabin, "when I was growing up, I watched my father fight battles that didn't end when he came home from war." He glanced at James with understanding in his eyes. Scout wasn't just a service dog to our family. He became a bridge between the world of trauma and the world of healing. An elderly woman in the row behind them dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The teenager who had been recording everything had long since put her phone away, completely absorbed in the real human drama unfolding before her. The flight attendant took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I'd like to share something too, if I may." She looked around the cabin, making eye contact with various passengers. "I've been with this airline for 6 years, and I've caught people trying to abuse service animal policies. I let that experience make me suspicious and bitter. I stopped seeing people and started seeing potential problems to solve." Her honesty seemed to resonate through the cabin. A few passengers nodded in understanding, while others leaned forward to hear better. "But that's no excuse," she continued, her voice stronger now. Looking at this photograph, she gestured to the wallet still in the first officer's hand. "I see more than just a veteran and his service dog. I see a father who served his country, a son who followed his own path to service, and a family that found healing through an amazing animal. I was so busy enforcing rules that I forgot to see the humanity in front of me." The senior flight attendant stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on her colleague's shoulder. "We all have moments when we need to step back and reassess," she said. "The question is what we do with those moments." James spoke up then, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "In the military, we learn that mistakes aren't what define us. It's how we respond to them that matters." Scout's tail thumped gently against the floor, as if agreeing with his handler's words. The first officer smiled, tucking the wallet back into his uniform pocket. "You know what made me want to become a pilot? he asked, addressing no one in particular. It wasn't just my father's service. It was watching him work with Scout, seeing how patience and understanding could transform fear into courage. Every time I step into that cockpit, I carry that lesson with me. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, had been watching the entire scene unfold from his seat near the front of the plane. He raised his hand hesitantly, like a student in class. When the first officer nodded at him, he asked in a clear voice that carried down the aisle, "Is that why you became a pilot? Because your dad was brave?" The question, innocent and direct as only a child's can be, brought fresh tears to several eyes in the cabin. The first officer walked over to the boy's seat and knelt down to eye level. "I became a pilot because my father taught me that serving others is one of the most important things we can do," he explained. "Sometimes that means flying combat missions, sometimes it means flying people home to their families, and sometimes," he glanced back at James and Scout, "it means standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." The flight attendant who had caused the initial confrontation stepped forward again, this time with renewed purpose. Her next words would demonstrate how a moment of shame could be transformed into an opportunity for growth and change. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, its rays now streaming directly through the windows, illuminating the faces of everyone involved in this unexpected moment of human connection. Outside, the sounds of airport operations continued, a reminder that while this powerful scene was unfolding, the world kept turning. But for everyone on Flight 2387, something fundamental has shifted. This wasn't just about a service dog or airline policies anymore. It had become a lesson about humanity, humility, and the courage to acknowledge when we're wrong. The flight was already 30 minutes behind schedule, but no one seemed to mind. Something more important than departure times was happening aboard Flight 2387. The flight attendant who had sparked the confrontation straightened her uniform and addressed the entire cabin, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "I'd like to do more than just apologize," she announced. "I want to make this right." She turned to face James and Scout directly. "Your story and your son's story deserves to be heard by more than just the people on this plane." The senior flight attendant stepped forward, firm in hand. "I've already contacted our corporate office. They want to speak with all of you once we land in Los Angeles." She looked around the cabin. "And to all our passengers, we'll be providing complimentary meals during the flight as a small token of appreciation for your patience." A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the cabin. The teenage girl who had been recording earlier raised her hand tentatively. I posted the video," she admitted, looking slightly ashamed. "It's already getting shared like crazy. People are calling it father and son flight story." Instead of anger, the first officer smiled. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said. "Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes being shared openly." He glanced at his watch, then added, "Speaking of which, I need to get back to the cockpit. We have some flying to do." The young boy who had asked about bravery earlier spoke up again. "Can Scout come visit us in first class? I've never met a real hero dog before." His mother began to shush him, but James laughed, the first real laugh since boarding the plane. "Tell you what," he said, "once we're at cruising altitude, maybe Scout and I can take a little walk up there. Would the crew be okay with that?" The flight attendant who had caused the initial confrontation jumped at the chance. "I'll personally escort them," she offered. "It's the least I can do." Her voice carried a new note of determination, as if she'd found a purpose in making amends. As the first officer headed back to the cockpit, passengers began settling into their seats. The incident had transformed the usual strangers on a plane atmosphere into something warmer, more connected. People were talking across aisles, sharing their own stories of service animals, veterans and their families, and moments when they'd learned important lessons about judgment. A retired teacher in row 12 raised her hand to get the flight attendant's attention. "You know," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades in the classroom, "I think we're all getting a masterclass in humanity today. In my 30 years of teaching, I always told my students that the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement." The flight attendant nodded, tears welling up again. "I think I needed that lesson more than anyone," she admitted. "Working in customer service, sometimes we get so focused on rules and procedures that we forget about the human stories behind them." As the plane began its final preparations for takeoff, the energy in the cabin was noticeably different. Passengers were helping each other stow bags, offering to swap seats so families could sit together, and several people had quietly slipped notes of support to James and Scout. The businessman who had been watching everything unfold from first class stood up one last time. "I'm an executive at a corporate training firm," he announced. "When we land, I'd like to talk to you all about turning this experience into a training program for customer service professionals. Stories like this need to be shared." The flight attendant's eyes lit up at the suggestion. She pulled out her phone and began taking notes, her earlier defensiveness completely replaced by a genuine desire to create positive change. "I'd like to be part of that," she said. "I think my experience today could help other people avoid making the same mistakes." As the plane finally began to push back from the gate, Scout settled comfortably at James's feet. The service dog seemed to sense that his mission today had expanded beyond supporting his handler. He had become part of a larger lesson about compassion, understanding, and the power of second chances. The young mother with the toddler leaned across the aisle. "You know what amazes me?" she whispered to James. "How something that started so negatively could turn into such a beautiful moment of connection. My daughter's going to grow up in a world that needs more stories like this." Outside the window, the morning sun continued its climb into the sky, casting long shadows across the tarmac. But inside Flight 2387, something bright had already dawned, a new understanding of how quick judgments can be transformed into opportunities for growth, and how one small incident on a routine flight could spark a movement for change in the airline industry and beyond. 6 months after that memorable flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles, the airline's largest training center buzzed with activity. The room was filled with flight attendants, gate agents, and airline staff from across the country, all gathered for a special presentation. At the front of the room stood 4 familiar faces: James with Scout by his side, his son the first officer, and the flight attendant whose actions had sparked an unexpected movement for change. "Welcome to our new Service with Compassion training program," the flight attendant began, her voice carrying confidence that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "What you're about to hear is a story about mistakes, learning, and the power of second chances." The viral video of their flight had reached millions of views, catching the attention of major news networks and aviation industry leaders. But more importantly, it had started a conversation about how airlines handle service animals and treat their passengers with disabilities. Looking back, the flight attendant continued, adjusting the microphone. "I thought I was doing my job by being strict about policies. What I didn't realize was that I had lost sight of the human element of our work." James stepped forward, Scout moving perfectly in sync with him. "When I boarded that plane 6 months ago, I was prepared for the usual questions about Scout. What I wasn't prepared for was how one difficult moment would transform into something so positive." The first officer, now promoted to training captain, shared his perspective. "As airline professionals, we're taught to follow procedures, but that day reminded us that behind every procedure, every policy, there's a human story. My father's story, Scout's story, even the story of the flight attendant who had the courage to admit she was wrong and work to make things better." In the audience, several people wiped away tears as they watched Scout demonstrate his service dog skills. The businessman who had proposed the training program sat in the front row, nodding approvingly as he took notes on his tablet. Since that day, the flight attendant explained, "Our airline has completely revamped its service animal policies. We've created clearer guidelines, yes, but more importantly, we've changed how we approach these situations. It's not just about checking documents anymore, it's about understanding the stories behind them." The changes hadn't stopped there. The airline had established a new scholarship program for veterans interested in aviation careers. They had also partnered with service dog training organizations to better educate their staff about the crucial role these animals play in people's lives. The teenage girl who had recorded the original video was now running a successful social media campaign advocating for service animal awareness. Her video had sparked countless conversations about compassion, prejudice, and the importance of seeing beyond first impressions. But the most meaningful change, James said, placing his hand on Scout's head, has been in the everyday interactions. "Last week, I flew to Chicago. At every step of the journey, from check-in to landing, I encountered airline staff who had been through this training program. The difference was remarkable. The flight attendant stepped forward again. We've learned that good service isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding people. Every passenger who boards our planes carries their own story, their own struggles, their own triumphs. Our job is to make their journey a little bit easier, a little bit kinder. The first officer shared how the incident had affected his own approach to leadership. In the cockpit, we have strict protocols we must follow. But this experience reminded me that the most important protocol of all is treating everyone with dignity and respect. As the presentation continued, Scout demonstrated how he helps James during moments of anxiety. The audience watched in amazement as the dog performed his trained responses, showing how service animals provide crucial support to their handlers. The businessman stood up to share the impact of the training program. In 6 months, we've trained over 5,000 airline employees. The feedback has been overwhelming. People aren't just learning new policies. They're learning empathy, understanding, and the importance of giving others the benefit of the doubt. Near the end of the session, a new flight attendant in training raised her hand. "How do you handle difficult situations now?" she asked the flight attendant who had sparked the original incident. "I remember that every interaction is an opportunity to learn and grow," she replied thoughtfully. "When I'm unsure about something, I ask questions with respect and curiosity rather than suspicion. And most importantly, I remember that day on Flight 2387 when I learned that our greatest mistakes can lead to our most important lessons." As the training session concluded, participants lined up to thank the presenters and Pet Scout, after asking permission, of course. The story of Flight 2387 had become more than just a viral moment. It had become a catalyst for real change in how the airline industry approaches customer service, disability rights, and human dignity. Outside the training center, the sun was setting on another busy day at the airport. Planes took off and landed, carrying thousands of passengers, each with their own stories, their own needs, and their own reasons for traveling. But thanks to one unforgettable flight and the courage of those involved to transform a negative experience into positive change, those journeys would be a little bit better, a little bit kinder, and a lot more understanding.